The cold October wind swept across the dusty cemetery of Silver Creek, Texas, as Clara Zimmerman stood alone before her husband's freshly dug grave in 1876, her black mourning veil fluttering like a crow's wing against the harsh landscape. Not a single family member had come to pay respects to Edward Zimmerman, a man who had dragged his young wife across 3 states before consumption claimed him, leaving her widowed at 23 in a town where she knew no one and had nothing but the clothes on her back and a wedding band that suddenly felt too heavy. Clara fought back tears as the preacher finished his generic sermon about a man he'd never met. The handful of townspeople who had come out of obligation rather than affection began to disperse, returning to their busy lives, leaving her to face the vast emptiness alone. The weight of her solitude pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden, making it difficult to breathe beneath her tight mourning corset. Then she felt someone sit beside her on the rough wooden bench. She didn't look up immediately, assuming it was the preacher with more hollow words of comfort. "I'm here," a deep voice said simply. Clara turned to find a tall man with sun-weathered skin and kind hazel eyes. His dark hair curled slightly under his worn hat, and his clothes, though dusty from the trail, were neat. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense. His nose had clearly been broken once or twice, and a thin scar traced his jawline, but there was something compelling about his face that made it difficult to look away. "You don't know me," she whispered, her voice scratchy from unshed tears. "No, madam, I don't," he replied, his gaze direct but gentle. "Name's Preston Galloway. Just rode into town yesterday. Was passing by and saw you sitting alone. Nobody should be alone at a time like this." Clara studied him, trying to discern his intentions. Edward had taught her to be wary of strangers, especially men with kind words. "I'm Clara Zimmerman. That's my husband." She nodded toward the grave. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Zimmerman." "Thank you," she said automatically, the words feeling hollow in her mouth. Edward hadn't been a kind man, but he'd been her husband, and now she was truly alone in a world that wasn't gentle to solitary women. They sat in silence as the cemetery emptied completely. The gravediggers waited at a respectful distance to finish their work. Clara knew she should leave, but she couldn't bear the thought of returning to the small rented room above the general store where Edward's presence still lingered. "You have family in town?" Preston asked, breaking the silence. Clara shook her head. "No kin anywhere nearby. Edward and I. We moved around a lot." Preston nodded, seeming to understand more than she'd said. "You have somewhere to stay tonight?" She stiffened, misinterpreting his question. "I'm not in need of charity, Mr. Galloway." His eyes widened slightly, and a faint color touched his cheeks beneath the tan. "I didn't mean. I just thought you might need a meal is all. Town's got a decent enough hotel restaurant." Clara felt a flush of embarrassment. "I apologize. My husband always said I was too quick to take offense." She twisted her wedding ring absently. "I have a room, but I haven't eaten since yesterday." Preston stood and offered his arm. "Then perhaps you'd allow me to escort you to dinner, Mrs. Zimmerman. No strings attached, just one lonely soul helping another." Clara hesitated. She barely knew this man, and the town would surely talk. But his eyes held no deceit she could detect, and the prospect of returning to her empty room was unbearable. "Very well, Mr. Galloway," she said, rising and taking his arm. "But I insist on paying my own way." He smiled then, a warm, genuine smile that transformed his weathered face. "As you wish, madam." The Silver Creek Hotel's small dining room was nearly empty when they arrived. Clara was conscious of the few patrons' curious glances as Preston led her to a corner table. A widow dining with a strange man mere hours after her husband's funeral was scandalous, but Clara found she couldn't summon the energy to care. The waitress, a plump woman with kind eyes, took their orders without comment, though Clara noted the speculative glance she cast between them. "What brings you to Silver Creek, Mr. Galloway?" Clara asked when they were alone, desperate to fill the silence with something other than thoughts of Edward. Preston removed his hat and set it aside, revealing hair darker than she'd first thought. "I've been working cattle drives between Texas and Kansas for years. Decided it was time to put down some roots. Heard there was land available in these parts." "And is there?" he nodded. "Bought a small spread about 5 miles outside town yesterday. Nothing fancy, but the previous owner left a decent cabin and the beginnings of a herd. You're fortunate. Land is hard to come by these days without a small fortune." "I've been saving for years," he said. "What about you, Mrs. Zimmerman? What will you do now?" The question caught Clara off guard. She'd been so focused on getting through the funeral that she hadn't allowed herself to think beyond it. I don't know. Edward didn't leave much. The doctor's bills took most of what we had." "Do you have a trade?" Preston asked gently. "I can sew quite well, and I worked as a schoolteacher before I married." "Silver Creek could use a teacher," he said. "I noticed quite a few children running wild in town." The waitress returned with their meals, and Clara was grateful for the interruption. The thought of staying in Silver Creek, where her only memories were of Edward's slow, painful death, made her stomach clench. As they ate, Preston told her about his life on the cattle drives, painting vivid pictures of thundering herds and star-filled nights on the open prairie. He spoke without bravado or exaggeration, and Clara found herself drawn into his stories, momentarily forgetting her grief and uncertainty. "You tell a fine tale, Mr. Galloway," she said when he finished describing a particularly harrowing river crossing. "Preston, please," he said. "And it's no tale, just life as I've lived it." Clara hesitated, then nodded. "Preston." His name felt strange on her tongue, the first time she'd addressed a man other than her husband by his given name in 5 years. When they finished their meal, Preston insisted on paying despite her protests. "Consider it a welcoming to Silver Creek," he said firmly. "You can return the favor someday when you're settled." He walked her back to her room above the general store as the sun set, casting long shadows across the dusty street. At the foot of the stairs, he removed his hat. "Thank you for the company, Mrs. Zimmerman," he said formally. "Clara," she corrected him. "And I should be thanking you, your kindness today." She faltered, emotion suddenly threatening to overwhelm her. Preston nodded, understanding in his eyes. "If you need anything at all, I'm staying at the livery until my place is habitable. Don't hesitate to ask." "That's very kind," Clara said, "but I'm sure I'll manage." He smiled slightly. "I've no doubt of that. You strike me as a capable woman, but everyone needs help sometimes." Clara watched him walk away, a tall figure in the gathering dusk, and felt something stir within her that she thought had died along with any affection she'd once had for Edward. She pushed it firmly aside. Her husband wasn't even cold in his grave, and she was noticing another man's smile. Shame washed over her as she climbed the stairs to her lonely room. The next morning, Clara awoke with a sense of purpose. She couldn't continue living above the general store indefinitely. Her meager savings wouldn't allow it. She needed work, and Preston's suggestion about teaching lingered in her mind. After dressing in her second-best black dress, her only other option besides her funeral clothes, she set out to find whoever was in charge of such matters in Silver Creek. The town was more alive than she'd seen it during Edward's illness. Cowboys and farmers mingled on the boardwalks, and wagons rolled down the main street carrying goods and families. Clara felt conspicuous in her widow's weeds, aware of the curious glances and whispered comments as she passed. She was directed to the mayor's office, a small room attached to the town's only bank. Mayor Wilkins, A portly man with an impressive mustache seemed surprised by her request but not displeased. "A school teacher, you say? Well now, that's providential. Our last teacher, Miss Phillips, ran off with a cattle buyer last spring. Been trying to find a replacement ever since." He studied her thoughtfully. "You have experience." 2 years in Cincinnati before my marriage, Clara confirmed. References. "I can write to the school board in Cincinnati," she offered, though she knew such correspondence could take weeks. The mayor tugged at his mustache. "Well, I don't know as we can wait that long. Children are falling behind. Tell you what, we'll give you a trial period. School buildings at the end of town. Been sitting empty too long." Clara felt a surge of relief. "When would you like me to start?" "Monday next. Give you time to prepare and get the word out to families." He named a modest salary that would at least cover basic living expenses. "There's living quarters attached to the schoolhouse. Nothing fancy, mind you, but it comes with the position." By noon, Clara had secured not only employment but a place to live. She felt a weight lift from her shoulders as she left the mayor's office. For the first time since Edward had fallen ill, she could see a path forward, however uncertain. She was so lost in thought that she nearly collided with Preston as he emerged from the mercantile. "Mrs. Zimmerman, Clara," he corrected himself, steadying her with a hand on her arm. "You look pleased about something." Clara couldn't help smiling. "I've been appointed the new school teacher. I start next week." "That's wonderful news," he said, genuine pleasure in his voice. "I told you Silver Creek needed a teacher." "Yes, you did." She hesitated, then added, "I wanted to thank you again for yesterday. Your kindness meant more than you know." "It was nothing," he said, looking slightly embarrassed. "Anyone would have done the same." "But they didn't," Clara said quietly. "You did." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a moment of connection that startled Clara with its intensity. She looked away first, flustered. "I should go. I need to prepare for my new position." "Of course." Preston cleared his throat. "I'll be bringing some supplies out to my place this afternoon. If you need help moving to the schoolhouse, I could lend a hand tomorrow." Clara's first instinct was to refuse. She'd spent 5 years with a husband who kept reminding her of everything he'd done for her, every obligation she owed him. But Preston's offer seemed to come without expectations, and the truth was, she did need help. "That would be very kind," she said finally. "I don't have much to move, but I'd appreciate the assistance. I'll come by around 9 if that suits." "That would be fine. Thank you, Preston." As she watched him stride away, Clara felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. She quickly suppressed it. One act of kindness, one offer of help, these didn't mean anything beyond simple human decency. She'd learned the hard way not to read too much into a man's attention. The next morning, Preston arrived promptly at 9 with a wagon. Clara was surprised to see him dressed in clean clothes, his hair still damp from washing. He'd even trimmed his beard. She told herself not to attribute any significance to his efforts. Her few possessions, clothing, books, a small trunk of linens, and Edward's shaving kit that she couldn't bring herself to discard, took up little space in the wagon. Preston handled everything with care, particularly a framed daguerreotype of Clara's parents, long deceased. "This is all?" he asked when they'd loaded the wagon. Clara nodded, feeling self-conscious about her meager belongings. "We traveled light. Edward didn't like to accumulate things." Preston seemed about to say something, then thought better of it. Instead, he helped her into the wagon with a gentle hand at her elbow. The schoolhouse sat on the outskirts of town, a simple white clapboard building with a small bell tower. Behind it was a modest cottage that would serve as Clara's new home. Both buildings looked neglected, with peeling paint and overgrown yards, but Clara felt a surge of excitement at the sight. This was hers, not Edward's. Not borrowed or temporary, but a place where she could build something of her own. "Needs some work," Preston observed as he helped her down from the wagon. "Yes, but it has potential," Clara said, already envisioning clean windows with curtains and flowers in the yard. The cottage was musty from disuse, but otherwise sound. It consisted of a front room with a small kitchen area, a bedroom just large enough for a bed and chest of drawers, and a tiny back porch. The furniture was basic but serviceable: a table with 2 chairs, a sagging sofa, an iron bedstead with a lumpy mattress. "It's perfect," Clara said, running her hand along the dusty mantelpiece. Preston raised an eyebrow. "If you say so. But that roof looks like it might leak, and I'm not sure about that stove pipe." "Are you trying to dampen my enthusiasm, Mr. Galloway?" Clara asked, amused despite herself. He grinned, transforming his serious face. "Just being practical, Mrs. Zimmerman. Tell you what, I've got some supplies and tools in the wagon. Let me at least check that roof before I go." Clara wanted to refuse, to insist she could manage on her own, but practicality won out. "Thank you. That would be helpful." While Preston examined the roof, Clara began cleaning, throwing open windows to let in fresh air and attacking the dust with a broom she found in a corner. By midday, the cottage was beginning to look habitable, and Preston had repaired not only a section of leaking roof, but also fixed the stove pipe and a loose floorboard on the back porch. "You didn't have to do all this," Clara said as they sat on the front step, sharing a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and apples that Preston had brought. "I know," he said, slicing an apple with his pocket knife. "But it needed doing, and I had the time." Clara studied him, trying to understand his motives. "Why are you being so kind to me? You don't even know me." Preston considered the question seriously. "I reckon it's because I know what it's like to be alone in a strange place." He handed her a slice of apple. "When I first started working cattle drives, I was 17 and greener than spring grass. An old cowhand named Hank took me under his wing, showed me the ropes. Probably saved my life a dozen times over. When I asked him why, he said someone had done the same for him once, and it was his way of paying it forward." "So I'm your good deed?" Clara asked, unsure whether to be touched or offended. Preston's eyes met hers directly. "No, madam. You're a person who deserved better than to sit alone at her husband's funeral." The simple honesty in his words struck Clara deeply. She looked away, blinking back sudden tears. "Thank you for saying that." They finished their lunch in companionable silence. As Preston prepared to leave, Clara gathered her courage. "Would you? That is, once I'm settled, perhaps you might come for dinner sometime, as a thank you for all your help." His face brightened. "I'd like that very much." "It might be a while," she warned. "I need to get the school in order first, and I'm not sure when I'll have time for social calls." "I'm not going anywhere," Preston said with a small smile. "My place will keep me busy for months." After he left, Clara stood in the doorway of her new home, watching his wagon disappear down the road. For the first time since Edward's illness began, she felt something like optimism stirring within her. Silver Creek might not be where she'd chosen to make her life, but perhaps it was where she needed to be. The next week passed in a blur of activity. Clara cleaned and organized the schoolhouse, created lesson plans, and met with parents who brought their children to register for classes. Mayor Wilkins introduced her around town, and gradually Clara began to feel less like an outsider and more like a member of the community. She saw Preston occasionally, usually from a distance as he loaded supplies or spoke with merchants. Once, their eyes met across the street, and he tipped his hat with a smile that warmed her more than it should have. Clara told herself firmly that his kindness was nothing more than neighborly concern, that her awareness of him was merely gratitude. She was still in mourning, after all, still wearing the black dresses that marked her as a widow. School began the following Monday with 23 students ranging from 6 to 16 years of age. Clara threw herself into teaching, grateful for the distraction from her confused feelings and uncertain future. The work was challenging but rewarding, and she found herself looking forward to each day in a way she hadn't experienced in years. 3 weeks after she began teaching, a late October storm swept through the region, bringing howling winds and driving rain that seemed determined to find every crack and crevice in the schoolhouse roof. Clara dismissed the children early, watching anxiously as they hurried home through the downpour. By evening, the storm had worsened, and Clara huddled in her cottage, listening to the wind rattling the windows and the steady drip of water into pots and buckets she'd placed strategically around the room. Just as she was preparing for a sleepless night, a pounding at her door startled her. She opened it to find Preston on her doorstep, rain streaming from his slicker. "Your roof," he shouted over the wind. "Saw it was leaking bad when I rode past. Thought you might need help." Clara stared at him in disbelief. "You rode out in this. You could have been hurt." "I'm fine," he insisted, stepping inside when she moved back. "But your roof might not be. Where's it leaking worst?" Bewildered by his sudden appearance but grateful for the help, Clara showed him the various drips and leaks. Without removing his wet coat, Preston climbed into the cottage's small attic access and somehow managed to temporarily patch the worst of the leaks. When he finally climbed down, he was soaked to the skin despite his slicker, and Clara insisted he sit by the fire while she made coffee. "You shouldn't have risked coming out in this weather," she scolded as she handed him a steaming cup. Preston shrugged, his wet shirt clinging to broad shoulders. "Couldn't let a lady drown in her own home." "Hardly drowning," Clara retorted, but she smiled despite herself. "Still, it was reckless." "Maybe," he conceded, "but I've ridden through worse. At least there's no lightning with this one." As the storm raged outside, they really talked for the first time. Clara found herself telling Preston about her childhood in Ohio, her parents' deaths from influenza when she was 18, and how she'd met Edward when he was passing through Cincinnati on business. "He was charming," she said softly, staring into the fire. "Promised me adventure and a new life out west. I was lonely and naive enough to believe him." Preston didn't press her for details about her marriage, but something in his expression told Clara he understood more than she was saying. "What about you?" she asked, eager to change the subject. "Have you always been a cowboy?" Preston laughed, a rich sound that filled the small room. "No, madam. Started out as a farmer's son in Missouri. Pa died in the war and Ma couldn't keep the place going. I headed west when I was 16, worked odd jobs until I found my way to the cattle drives." "And now you're a rancher," Clara observed. "Trying to be," he said with a rueful smile. "Still figuring it out as I go." The storm began to ease around midnight, but Clara couldn't bring herself to suggest Preston leave. His presence filled the cottage with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire, and she wasn't ready to return to her solitude. Finally, as the rain gentled to a soft patter, Preston rose reluctantly. "I should get back. My horse will be wondering if I've abandoned him." "Of course." Clara stood as well, suddenly aware of how close they were standing in the small room. "Thank you for coming to my rescue. Again." Preston's eyes, illuminated by the firelight, studied her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I'm glad I was nearby." For a moment, Clara thought he might step closer, might reach for her. Part of her wanted him to, a realization that both thrilled and terrified her, but Preston merely reached for his hat and slicker. "I'll come by tomorrow to check the roof properly," he said, his voice slightly rough. "Make sure those patches hold." "You don't have to, I want to," he said simply, and Clara fell silent, unable to argue with the quiet conviction in his voice. At the door, he turned back. "Clara, I hope you know that I respect your situation. You're mourning, I'm not trying to. That is, I don't expect." Clara felt a surge of affection for this man who could face down stampeding cattle but stumbled over his words with her. "I know, Preston, and I appreciate your friendship more than I can say," he nodded, seeming relieved. "Good night, then." "Good night. And please be careful riding home." After he left, Clara stood by the window watching his shadowy figure mount his horse and ride away into the rainy night. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her heart racing beneath her fingers. This wasn't merely gratitude or friendly affection, she realized with a mixture of dismay and elation. This was something else entirely, something she'd never truly felt for Edward, something both wonderful and frightening in its intensity. The next day, Preston returned as promised to repair her roof properly. Clara insisted on helping, handing up tools and materials as he worked. They fell into an easy rhythm, and Clara found herself laughing at his stories of ranch life and cattle drive mishaps. "You should laugh more often," Preston said during a break, watching her with a warmth that made her cheeks flush. "It suits you." "I haven't had much cause for laughter recently," Clara admitted. "No, I suppose not." Preston's expression grew serious. "I'm sorry about your husband." Whatever kind of man he was, losing someone is never easy. Clara looked away, uncomfortable with his perception. "Edward and it wasn't a happy marriage. Does that make me a terrible person to admit?" "No," Preston said gently. "Just an honest one." Over the next few weeks, Preston became a regular visitor to the schoolhouse. He helped with repairs, brought fresh vegetables from his garden, and sometimes simply sat on the porch with Clara in the evenings, talking about everything and nothing as the sun set over the Texas plains. The townsfolk noticed, of course. Clara heard the whispers when she went to the mercantile or post office speculation about the widowed schoolteacher and the solitary rancher. Some disapproved of what they saw as Clara's disregard for proper mourning, while others thought Preston was simply taking advantage of a vulnerable woman. "You should be careful of your reputation," advised Mrs. Fletcher, the minister's wife, after church one Sunday in November. "People are talking. Let them talk," Clara replied with more confidence than she felt. "Mr. Galloway is a friend who has been kind enough to help me with repairs to the schoolhouse. There's nothing improper about it." But there was something improper about the way her heart leaped whenever she saw Preston riding toward the schoolhouse, or how she found herself thinking of him during quiet moments in class. Clara tried to convince herself that what she felt was merely friendship, but deep down, she knew it was more. For his part, Preston never overstepped the boundaries of propriety. He was unfailingly respectful, careful never to call too late or stay too long. But Clara caught him watching her sometimes with an expression that suggested he was fighting the same battle. She was trying to honor her period of mourning while dealing with feelings that grew stronger with each passing day. As Thanksgiving approached, Mayor Wilkins announced that the town would hold a harvest celebration in the church hall. "Everyone's expected to attend," he told Clara after school one day. "Community spirit and all that." Clara had been dreading the holiday season, her first without family. The prospect of a town celebration filled her with anxiety, but she knew attendance was part of her role as schoolteacher. "Will you go to the harvest celebration?" she asked Preston the next time he visited, trying to sound casual. "Wasn't planning to," he admitted, repairing a loose hinge on one of her cupboards. "Not much for crowds." "Oh," Clara tried to hide her disappointment. The thought of facing the event alone was daunting. Preston glanced up, catching her expression. "Unless, would you like me to accompany you?" "I couldn't ask you to do that if you'd rather not attend." You're not asking, I'm offering. He set down his tools and faced her directly. Clara, I'd be honored to escort you if you'd like me to. The sincerity in his voice melted her hesitation. I would like that very much. The night of the celebration, Clara spent an uncharacteristic amount of time on her appearance. She had no festive clothes, only the black dresses of mourning, but she chose her best one, and added a touch of color with a blue ribbon at her throat. A small rebellion against the strict mourning customs she'd been observing. Preston arrived precisely on time, wearing a clean black suit that transformed him from rugged rancher to respectable gentleman. His eyes widened appreciatively when Clara opened the door. "You look beautiful," he said simply. Clara blushed, unused to compliments. "Thank you. You clean up rather well yourself." The church hall was decorated with autumn leaves and harvest bounty. Nearly everyone in Silver Creek had turned out for the celebration, and all eyes seemed to turn toward Clara and Preston as they entered. Clara felt a moment of panic, but Preston's steady presence beside her gave her courage. "Ignore them," he murmured, guiding her toward a table with a gentle hand at the small of her back. "They'll find something else to gossip about soon enough." The evening progressed better than Clara had expected. The food was plentiful, the music lively, and Preston proved to be an attentive escort, making sure her plate and cup were never empty and introducing her to ranchers and farmers she hadn't yet met through the school. When the fiddlers struck up a waltz, Preston hesitated, then turned to Clara. "Would it be inappropriate to ask you to dance?" Clara knew it would further fuel the town's gossip, but in that moment she didn't care. "I'd like that." Preston's hand was warm and steady as he led her to the dance floor. He moved with unexpected grace for such a tall man, guiding her through the steps with confidence. Clara, who hadn't danced since before her marriage, felt herself relaxing into the rhythm, allowing herself to enjoy the simple pleasure of movement and music. "You're a surprisingly good dancer for a cowboy," she teased as they circled the floor. Preston's eyes crinkled with amusement. "My mother insisted all her sons learn. Said no child of hers would stomp around a dance floor like a newborn colt." Clara laughed, drawing even more curious glances from the townspeople. "She sounds like a formidable woman." "She was," he agreed, a touch of sadness crossing his features. "She passed 5 years ago." "I'm sorry," Clara said softly. "You must miss her. Every day." His arm tightened slightly around her waist. "She would have liked you, said she always wanted a daughter with spirit." The comment hung between them, laden with implications neither was ready to acknowledge. Clara's cheeks warmed, but she didn't look away from Preston's steady gaze. When the music ended, they remained on the floor a moment too long, reluctant to break the connection. Finally, Preston stepped back, releasing her with obvious reluctance. "Thank you for the dance," he said formally, but his eyes conveyed much more. "You're welcome," Clara replied, equally formal but with a small smile that was just for him. As they walked back to their table, Clara was acutely aware of the speculative glances and whispered comments following them. Mrs. Fletcher's disapproving frown was particularly noticeable, but Clara found she couldn't bring herself to care. For the first time in years, she'd felt truly alive on that dance floor, and she refused to feel guilty about it. Later, as Preston walked her home under a canopy of stars, Clara felt a growing tension between them. Something had shifted during that dance, bringing their unspoken feelings closer to the surface. At her door, Preston removed his hat, turning it nervously in his hands. "I had a wonderful evening, Clara." "So did I," she said softly. "Thank you for accompanying me." He took a deep breath as if gathering courage. "Clara, I know it's too soon. I know you're still in mourning and I respect that, but I care for you more than I should, perhaps." Clara's heart pounded in her chest. "Preston, you don't need to say anything," he interrupted gently. "I just wanted you to know, and to tell you that I'll wait. However long it takes, I'll wait." Clara stared up at him, this man who had appeared in her life when she needed him most, who had asked for nothing while giving so much. In that moment, all her carefully constructed barriers crumbled. "What if I don't want to wait?" she whispered. Preston's expression shifted from resignation to hope. "What are you saying, Clara?" "I'm saying that Edward and I had been strangers long before he died. I'm saying that I've done my duty as his widow, but I can't pretend to mourn a marriage that brought me little joy." She took a shaky breath. "And I'm saying that I care for you too, Preston, more than I thought possible." He stepped closer, one hand rising to gently touch her cheek. "Are you sure?" "The town will talk. Let them," Clara said with newfound confidence. "I'm tired of living my life according to others' expectations." Preston's smile was like sunrise breaking over the plains. "Clara Zimmerman, you are the most remarkable woman I've ever met." Then he was kissing her, gently at first, as if afraid she might break or change her mind. Clara responded with a passion that surprised them both, her arms winding around his neck as she pressed closer. When they finally parted, both were breathless. "I should go," Preston said reluctantly, his forehead resting against hers. "Yes," Clara agreed, though everything in her wanted him to stay. He kissed her once more, briefly but with promise. "I'll come by tomorrow. I'll be waiting," she said, smiling up at him. As winter settled over Silver Creek, Clara and Preston's relationship blossomed despite the town's gossip. Clara gradually replaced her black dresses with colors, first muted grays and lavenders, then brighter blues and greens that matched her eyes. She still wore her wedding ring, a concession to propriety, but it no longer felt like a shackle. Preston's ranch began to take shape with Clara's help. She planted a garden near the cabin, hung curtains in the windows, and added feminine touches that transformed the bachelor's quarters into a home. They spent Sundays there together, planning and dreaming, careful to maintain appearances but increasingly certain of their future together. By spring, Clara had completed her trial period as schoolteacher and been officially hired on a permanent basis. The town's initial disapproval of her relationship with Preston had largely faded as they witnessed the positive changes in both. Even Mrs. Fletcher had grudgingly acknowledged that Clara was an excellent teacher, regardless of her personal life. On a warm April evening, exactly 6 months after Edward's funeral, Preston took Clara for a ride to his favorite spot on his property, a hilltop overlooking a small creek, lined with budding cottonwoods. He spread a blanket on the ground and they sat watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "I love it here," Clara said, leaning against his shoulder. "It's so peaceful." "I thought we might build the new house here," Preston said casually, "if you like the view." Clara turned to him, her heart suddenly racing. "New house?" Preston reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. "I had planned a fancy speech, but now that the moment's here, I find I just want to ask you straight out." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold ring with a small pearl. "Clara Zimmerman, will you marry me?" Tears filled Clara's eyes as she looked from the ring to Preston's hopeful face. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." His face lit with joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger above her wedding band. Clara immediately removed the gold band that had tied her to Edward, placing it in her pocket. "I don't need this anymore," she said firmly. "My past is behind me now." Preston gathered her into his arms, kissing her with a tenderness that spoke of promises kept and a future filled with love. "I never expected to find you," he murmured against her hair. "Never thought I'd meet someone who would make me want to settle down, build a life." "And I never expected to find happiness again," Clara replied, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. especially not with a dusty cowboy who sat beside me at a funeral." Preston laughed, the sound echoing across the hilltop. "Best decision I ever made." They were married that June in a simple ceremony in the Silver Creek church. Clara wore a dress of pale blue instead of traditional white, a symbol of her new beginning rather than a first marriage. Preston's ranch hands and Clara's students filled the church, along with most of the townspeople who had come to accept and even embrace the unlikely couple. As they exchanged vows, Clara thought of that October day when she'd sat alone at Edward's funeral, believing her life was over. She could never have imagined then that a stranger's simple act of kindness, "I'm here," would lead to this moment of perfect happiness. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Preston kissed her with a promise of forever, and Clara knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home at last, not in a place, but in the arms of the man who had seen her when she was invisible, who had offered friendship when she needed it most, and whose love had given her the courage to begin again. And as they walked out of the church into the bright June sunshine, Clara's hand firmly clasped in Preston's, she silently thanked whatever twist of fate had brought him to her side on that lonely day, grateful beyond words for the second chance at love she'd never expected to find.